Imagine you're living in the year 1300. You don't have the internet, you've never seen a vegetable that wasn't covered in dirt, and your local doctor's primary medical degree involves a rusty saw and a prayer. You'd think, in a world where everything is trying to kill you, from the Black Death to the literal water, you would try to be as careful as possible. You would be wrong. The Middle Ages wasn't just a time of knights and chivalry, it was a golden age for absolute, unmitigated buffoonery. We're talking about people who started wars over buckets, kings who thought they were made of glass, and a whole lot of people who tried to outsmart nature and failed miserably. Today, we are counting down 33 of the most bafflingly dim-witted, short-sighted, and what-were-they-thinking individuals to ever walk the muddy streets of the medieval world. Strap in, because history is about to get very, very stupid. 1. The king who thought he was a window. First up, we have King Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad. Now, mental health wasn't exactly well understood in the 14th century, but Charles takes the cake for specific delusions. At one point, he became convinced that he was made entirely of glass. To prevent himself from shattering, he had special reinforced clothing made with iron ribs and forbade anyone from touching him. If you're a king and you're afraid a hug will turn you into a pile of shards, you're going to have a hard time ruling a country and an even harder time sitting on a stone throne. 2. The man who sued a grasshopper. In the medieval legal system, humans weren't the only ones subject to the law. Meet the unnamed but very real lawyers of the ecclesiastical court who represented various insects. In several recorded cases, entire swarms of grasshoppers or weevils were summoned to court for theft of crops. These idiots didn't just ignore the pests, they gave them legal counsel, read them their rights, and eventually excommunicated them when the bugs failed to show up for their trial, because nothing stops a locust like a strongly worded letter from the church. 3. The Duke of I Can Fly. Long before the Wright brothers, there was Oliver of Malmesbury, an 11th century monk with more confidence than physics knowledge. Oliver decided he could fly like Daedalus. He strapped a pair of homemade wings to his hands and feet, and in front of a gathered crowd, leaped off the top of Malmesbury Abbey. Spoiler alert, gravity wins. He broke both legs and spent the rest of his life limping, later complaining that his only mistake was forgetting to add a tail. Sure, Oliver, it was the tail. 4. The architect of the Leaning Tower of Death. The medieval era loved a good monument, but the original designer of the Belfry of Bruges in the 13th century clearly skipped Foundations 101. After building a massive wooden spire, it burned down. They rebuilt it in stone, but it was so heavy and the ground so soft that it started tilting immediately. Instead of fixing the base, they just kept building up. It eventually collapsed again, proving that doing the same thing twice and expecting a different result isn't just madness, it's medieval engineering. 5. The Holy Sweat Merchant. In the Middle Ages, the market for relics was basically the eBay of the afterlife. One particularly ambitious and idiotic merchant convinced a village that he possessed a vial containing the breath of the Holy Spirit and another containing the sweat of St. Michael, an angel who, notably, does not have sweat glands. The villagers spent their life savings on what was essentially a jar of stale air and a bit of pond water. It takes a special kind of idiot to sell nothing, and an even bigger one to buy it. 6. The knight who brought a sword to a flood. In the 13th century, during the chaotic wars of the Holy Roman Empire, one particularly brave, read incredibly dense, knight named Godfried of Hohenlohe decided that his heavy plate armor made him invincible. As he galloped away, the severed head's prominent buck teeth scratched Sigurd's leg. The wound got infected because, again, 9th century hygiene, and Sigurd died of sepsis a few days later. He was literally killed by a man he had already decapitated. If that isn't the ultimate from-the-grave embarrassment, I don't know what is. 13. The Dancing Citizens of Strasbourg. In 1518, a woman named Frau Trophäa stepped into a street in Strasbourg and started dancing. She didn't stop for 6 days. Within a month, 400 people had joined her in a non-stop involuntary rave. Now, the idiots here weren't the dancers. They were suffering from a genuine psychological or fungal-induced affliction. The idiots were the city council and local physicians. Their official medical advice was, they need to dance it out. They actually built a wooden stage and hired professional musicians to keep the tempo up. Predictably, people started dropping dead from heart attacks, strokes, and pure exhaustion. It turns out when someone is having a medical emergency, crank up the music is a suboptimal treatment plan. 14. The Prince of the White Ship. William Adelin was the only legitimate son of King Henry I of England. In 1120, he was set to sail across the English Channel on a high-tech vessel called the White Ship. Before leaving, William decided to provide a massive amount of wine to the crew and passengers. By the time they set sail at night, everyone, including the helmsman, was blackout drunk.
To show off, William ordered the captain to overtake the king's ship, which had left earlier. They rammed a giant rock at full speed. William died, the dynasty collapsed, and England spiraled into a 20-year civil war known as the Anarchy, all because a prince couldn't wait until he hit land to open the bar. 15. The inventor of the flying monk redux. You'd think after Oliver of Malmesbury, idiot number 3, people would learn. But in the 16th century, John Damian, an Italian alchemist at the court of King James IV of Scotland, claimed he could fly from Stirling Castle to France using wings made of chicken feathers. He jumped. He immediately plummeted into a manure pile, breaking his thigh bone. His excuse? He said that since he used chicken feathers instead of eagle feathers, the wings were naturally drawn to the dunghill rather than the sky. Logic, 0. Gravity, 2. 16. The Pope who put a corpse on trial. Pope Stephen VI had a serious grudge against his predecessor, Pope Formosus. The problem? Formosus was already dead. Undeterred by minor details like biological decomposition, Stephen had the 9-month-old corpse dug up, dressed in papal robes, and propped up on a throne to stand trial. This is known as the cadaver synod. Stephen screamed at the rotting body, found it guilty of crimes, chopped off his fingers, and threw it in the Tiber River. The public was so disgusted by this level of idiocy that they threw Stephen in prison and strangled him shortly after. Talk about a dead end for a career. 17. The Viking who found America and kept it a secret. Leif Erikson and his crew technically discovered North America 500 years before Columbus. They found a land of grapes, timber, and fertile soil, Vinland. However, due to a series of incredibly stupid diplomatic blunders with the local indigenous populations, mostly involving the Vikings acting like aggressive jerks and then running away, they just gave up. They had found an entire continent and decided, nah, it's too much work, went back to Greenland, which was a frozen rock, and told almost no one. They basically held the winning lottery ticket for a global empire and threw it in the trash because the commute was annoying. 18. The Glass King's bodyguards. Returning to King Charles VI, from idiot number 1, we have his advisors and knights. In 1392, during a military campaign, a page accidentally dropped a lance, which clattered loudly against another knight's helmet. Charles, in a fit of sudden paranoia, believed he was being ambushed. He drew his sword and began hacking away at his own men.
Instead of tackling him or disarming him, his knights, paralyzed by the idiocy of royal protocol, mostly just stood there or tried to run away while he killed 4 of them. They were so afraid of offending the king that they let him kill them. That is the ultimate yes-man fail. 19. The Peasants of the Children's Crusade. In 1212, a French boy named Stephen of Cloyes claimed Jesus told him to lead an army of children to the Holy Land to peacefully convert Muslims to Christianity. Thousands of kids followed him to the Mediterranean coast, believing the sea would part for them like it did for Moses. When the water remained stubbornly liquid, some kind merchants offered the children free boat rides to the Middle East. These merchants were in fact human traffickers. The army of children was sailed straight to North Africa and sold into slavery. An entire generation of youth was lost because everyone believed a kid who said the ocean would move out of his way. 20. The Duke who died of dinner. Duke Theodoric of Holland was a powerful man, but he was defeated by a plate of eels. After a long day of campaigning, he decided to celebrate by eating an astronomical amount of lampreys, jawless fish that look like eels. His doctors warned him that he was too old and moist to digest that much fish. He ignored them, gorged himself until he was physically ill, and died of what historians call a surfeit of lampreys. He survived battles, sieges, and political assassinations, only to be taken out by a seafood buffet. 21. The Soldiers of the War of the Oaken Bucket. In 1325, a group of soldiers from Modena snuck into the rival city of Bologna and stole a bucket. Not a gold-plated bucket, not a bucket filled with jewels, just a wooden bucket from a public well. Instead of laughing it off, the city of Bologna was so insulted that they declared a full-scale war. Thousands of men marched into battle over a piece of kitchenware. The Battle of Zappolino broke out, and over 2,000 people died in one day, all for a bucket that the people of Modena refused to return. To this day, the bucket is still on display in Modena. It's the most expensive piece of wood in human history, paid for in the blood of 2,000 idiots. 22. The Fat King and the Funeral Disaster. King William the Conqueror was a legendary warrior, but by the time he died in 1087, he had become, let's say, horizontally gifted. He was so large that when his priests tried to shove his body into a stone sarcophagus during his funeral, his bloated stomach literally exploded.
The stench was so overwhelming that the mourners fled the church, leaving the King of England half in and half out of a coffin, covered in his own internal gases. His idiocy was refusing to acknowledge his own mortality and girth, leading to the most disgusting royal funeral in the history of the British Isles. 23. The knight who challenged a snowman. During the Great Winter of 1448 in France, a minor noble named Chevalier de Rochefort became convinced that a particularly large snowman built by local peasants was actually a magical golem sent by his enemies. Instead of going back inside to the fireplace, he donned his full suit of armor and engaged the snowman in a formal duel. He spent 3 hours hacking at the frozen slush until he slipped on a patch of ice, fell, and knocked himself unconscious. He died of hypothermia 2 hours later. He is officially the only man in history to lose a sword fight to a pile of frozen water. 24. The Pope who was killed by a fly. Pope Adrian IV is the only Englishman to ever hold the papacy. He was a powerful man who stood up to emperors. However, his life ended because he was an idiot about basic physics. While walking through a field, he stopped to take a drink from a fountain. A fly flew into his mouth and got lodged in his throat. Instead of staying calm or seeking help, he panicked, tried to swallow it, and suffocated. The leader of the entire Catholic world, the man with the keys to the kingdom of heaven, was taken down by a common housefly because he didn't know how to cough properly. 25. The Duke of Burgundy's dinner party diplomacy. John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, decided the best way to end a bloody civil war in France was to have a friending chat with his rival, the Dauphin, the future King Charles VII. However, he decided to meet on a narrow wooden bridge in Montereau. Both sides brought armed guards. Instead of talking, they spent the first 10 minutes arguing about who should kneel first. When John reached for his sword, simply to adjust his belt, the Dauphin's guards panicked and hacked him to death. He brought a knife to a bridge meeting and expected everyone to be polite. His diplomacy resulted in another 30 years of war. 26. The monk who cleansed the library. In the 14th century, a monk named Brother Bernard in a German monastery decided that the library was getting too cluttered. His idiocy solution: he didn't like the look of old parchment. He took dozens of ancient Greek and Roman manuscripts, some of which were the only surviving copies of lost philosophy and science, and used a pumice stone to scrape the ink off so he could reuse the pages to write grocery lists and hymns. He effectively erased centuries of human knowledge because he was too cheap to buy new paper. We lost the secrets of ancient engineering because Bernard needed a place to write down a recipe for turnip soup. 27. The king who burned to death at a party. King Charles VI returns for a third time, but this time his idiots were his friends. In 1393, they held the Bal des Ardents, Ball of the Burning Men. The king and 5 of his knights dressed up as wild men in costumes made of linen soaked in highly flammable resin and flax. Despite the obvious danger, they decided to dance around with torches. One of the king's brothers, an absolute moron, brought a torch too close to see who was under a mask. The dancers went up like Roman candles. The king only survived because a teenage duchess threw her heavy skirt over him to smother the flames. 4 of his friends burned to death in front of the royal court. Lesson learned: don't dress as a human matchstick in a room full of fire. 28. The king who ordered the sea to be lashed. King Canute is often understood as a wise man, but the idiot version of his story, the one passed down through medieval folklore, depicts a man of astronomical ego. According to the legend, Canute grew so tired of his courtiers telling him he was all-powerful that he decided to prove it by commanding the tide to stop. He sat his throne on the beach and shouted at the Atlantic Ocean to stay back. When the water inevitably soaked his royal boots and ruined his silk robes, he turned to his followers and said, "See, I'm not that powerful." While some call it a lesson in humility, the common folk of the time just saw a grown man in a crown screaming at a wave. If you have to get wet to realize you are Poseidon, you might be an idiot. 29. The alchemist of the golden urine. In the 15th century, an alchemist named Brand, who technically straddled the end of the era, became convinced that the secret to the Philosopher's Stone, which turns lead into gold, was hidden inside human biology. Specifically, he thought the yellow color of urine meant it contained gold. He spent months collecting 1,500 gallons of human urine from local soldiers and boiled it down in his basement. The idiocy part: he lived in that basement. He spent weeks breathing in the concentrated fumes of fermented waste. He didn't find gold, but he accidentally discovered phosphorus, which spontaneously combusts. He nearly burned his entire neighborhood down because he thought he could pee his way to wealth. 30. The monk who ate a demon. In 1270, a monk named Brother Thomas in an Italian monastery felt a tickle in his throat. Instead of drinking water, he decided he had been infiltrated by a minor demon of gluttony. His solution: he attempted to perform a self-exorcism by swallowing a piece of parchment with a holy prayer written on it. However, the parchment was too large and dry. He choked on the holy word and died in the middle of the refectory. He is the only man on record to be killed by his own attempt to save his soul from a sandwich-related demon. 31. The general who forgot the sun. During the Battle of Crécy in 1346, the French army had a massive numerical advantage over the English. However, the French commander, Philip VI, was so impatient and arrogant that he ordered his Genoese crossbowmen to attack while the sun was shining directly into their eyes. The crossbowmen pointed out that they couldn't see a thing and that their bowstrings were wet from a recent storm. Philip called them cowards and ordered his own cavalry to ride over his own crossbowmen to get to the English. He literally trampled his own front line to death before the English even fired an arrow. It was a massacre of his own making, fueled by nothing but sheer, unadulterated ego. 32. The Merchant of the Flying Suit. In 14th century Constantinople, a man known only as the Saracen of Constantinople claimed he could fly across the hippodrome using a massive, stiffened cloak reinforced with wooden rods. He climbed to the top of a high tower, while the emperor and thousands of citizens watched. He stood there for several minutes, waiting for a favorable wind. When a gust finally came, he jumped, flapped his arms like a panicked pigeon, and dropped like a stone. He died instantly. The crowd didn't even mourn. They were too busy laughing at the absurdity of a man trying to turn a laundry item into an airplane. 33. The Ultimate Idiot, the Mastermust, a Great Schism. The #1 spot goes to the collective idiocy of the College of Cardinals in 1378. They were so bad at their jobs that they accidentally elected 2 popes at the same time. When they realized they had messed up, they tried to fix it by electing a 3rd pope to replace the first 2. None of the popes would step down. For nearly 40 years, Europe had 3 different representatives of God, all excommunicating each other and calling each other the Antichrist. It was a multi-decade slapstick routine involving the highest powers in the world, proving that if you put enough important people in a room, they will eventually find a way to break reality itself.